Hey guys, welcome back to the Wild Nutrition Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Heskett, and today's episode, we are going to be talking about wild game. I know not all of you are hunters, but many of you are. And so we're going to talk about how to cook wild game in a way that tastes good and is also good for you. Because obviously, like frying things is always going to make anything taste good. Like you can take a crappy piece of meat, fry it, and it'd be like edible. But we want to talk about wild game. If you are curious about it, maybe you have obviously hunters, you have access to it, but maybe you're someone who your family hunts and you get some wild game and you're like, I don't know what the fuck to do with it. Or you are looking at someone like Force of Nature, where you can buy wild game, you can buy elk and venison and bison off of them, and you're just like, I don't know what to do with it. Because if you look online, a lot of times the wild game recipes, they're getting better, but there's still a lot of just like fried or adding a ton of things that aren't super healthy to it, or not macro friendly, I should say. Adding a ton of calories because they are so lean. And a lot of people are worried because it's so lean, like, what happens if I fuck this up? Is it going to be gamey? Like, I don't want to spend money, or I don't want to spend all this time cooking something if it's going to be gamey. So right off the bat, first thing I want to say is if you get the classic deer steaks, these are my least favorite cuts of meat, because they're not steaks. So I want to address this first because it is super common. It is probably something, if you're not getting ground, you're probably going to be gifted these and what I do with them. So if you take the same cut from a cow, you make it thicker, it's osso buco. It is a shank cut. It is all the muscles of the back leg. It is not tender like a steak. It's not like a ribeye or anything. That would be your back strap, which would be not tenderloin, but that's more like your ribeyes would be part of the back strap. So when you get a deer steak, and the reason is there's not really like a venison or whitetail, mule deer, blacktail deer. They're closer in size to sheep, to lamb. So think of lamb chops instead of like a big old ribeye steak. So if you do venison, quote unquote, ribeyes, which I've done in the past, or venison chops, it's kind of a pain in the butt to do, but it is cool. It is the same size as getting lamb chops. It's much smaller. So people want steaks because they're like, it's red meat. Most Americans want beef, so they go with the steak, and it's affordable to do. The downside of this is the fat on deer is not very good. There's a reason you don't see deer tallow or anything like that, because it's not great. It's pretty terrible. It's not that it necessarily tastes bad. So when they do the deer steaks, that back leg cut, that saw is going to go through super fast, and that marrow has fat in it, so that can smear that fat over the steak and give it that gamey flavor that a lot of people know and don't like. It not all the time, but it can, especially after a couple cuts going through. Maybe that first steak doesn't, but after that, like that blade starts to get coated, and that starts to go through and start to give it that off-putting flavor. Especially if it's not like the sharpest, if it hasn't been recently replaced. So for getting that, which is fine because we've been gifted, the best thing you can do is marinate it. Marinate it in something like red wine vinegar, balsamic vinegar, or red wine, something that's going to give it a lot of flavor. And you'll see a lot of times bay leaves and juniper berries used, some very strong flavors to, if there's gaminess, it kind of hides it. Actually, I skipped over the fat, so I'll come back to the fat and why it's a bad thing. I shouldn't say bad thing, but not ideal for most people. So doing something like that will help tenderize the meat, and it will allow you to flavor it if there is any gaminess, which there's a higher chance of gaminess with that, again, with that potential of the marrow being a light like spread over it. But also, in between the muscles, there can be fat. So it's all the leg muscles put together. So you have, if we're talking like human, well, deer have the same thing. You have your quadriceps, so 4 big muscles there. The kind of like the hamstring muscle, like there's multiple muscle groups in there, and in between there can be intermuscular fat, but there's also a gland in there that if you're doing roast like I do and you cut that leg apart, you want to make sure you get rid of that. Well, you don't really have that chance. Some people might be able to get in there and poke that out. But if you can't, that can also be very game because it's a gland and it's not great. I'll say that. So marinate those and then only cook them unless you're going to slow cook them, which gives you a better, easier time to like do marinades. You can also do like Mexican style marinades, like Southwest. Those can have some strong flavors, spices. Think of like very like strong flavoring with this stuff. Cook it to medium rare or slow cook it. Like that's your options. Nowhere in between. If you like steaks well done, it's going to be like trying to eat a tire. It's not very good. It doesn't have the fat like beef. It is super lean. So it is going to be like you took eye around roast and cooked it to well done. It's going to be dry and it's going to be tough. It's not going to be great. So we want to tenderize it, especially if you're not a medium rare fan or you accidentally overcook it because they're generally very thin. And it's kind of like a minute steak, like cook it really quick. So if you are slow cooking it, try to remove the marrow that's in the middle of the bone. Or if you're pan frying it, try to remove some, poke the marrow out of that. So deer fat is very high in stearic acid, which might not mean much to you right now. But stearic acid is going to coat your mouth. So another food high in stearic acid is chocolate. And if you eat chocolate, it gets all over your mouth and kind of coats. And it's delicious when it's from chocolate. But when it's from deer fat, you get this fat that coats everything. It feels like if you eat a decent amount, like we'll get some that sometimes gets into soup. And then it almost feels like someone took like chapstick and put it on your lips. But if it's gamey, you're getting not just like, oh, like that piece, it wasn't great, let me just swallow it quick. It will coat your whole mouth and stay there because it's a fat. It's kind of like, and so those flavors are caught in fat. So it's not water soluble, it's fat. So you need something to break up fat to get rid of it. Kind of like, if you have, there's a moth, random, I'm like, it right in front of me. I saw it behind me. If you're watching this on Spotify, like you would see the moth fly behind me, but literally just went right in front of my face. So if you have something spicy, because capsaicin is fat soluble, so it's like why water doesn't really help. It's like it temporarily relieves and then it just comes back right back. So you need to use milk or you need something else to kind of like break, like that helps with like removing fat soluble stuff. So we want to try to remove that. And that's really the only way is using other liquids once it's in your mouth, other than water. Sometimes it tastes okay, but the texture and the consistency can be very, very off-putting. So we want to try to remove as much fat as possible. Some people don't mind it. And a lot of the gamey flavor does come from the fat. So if you are harvesting the deer yourself and you're like, man, there's all this fat, especially like with a doe, there's a lot of fat. I don't want to, have anything go to waste. You can use it for other products. I'm not an expert here, but I know people do use deer tallow for multiple things. I actually tried to use it for candles years ago. So what you do is you throw it into a pan, you render it down, and if you want to use it for cooking or anything, you just see if it has a gamey taste. If it doesn't, you're good. If it does, you get rid of it. So you test it out that way, and then you know if there's any like fat left on other pieces of the deer, if it's going to be gamey or not, and how like, especially when you get to the ground stuff, how strict you need to be with removing that fat. But if you are trying to use it for stuff, I will say the candle thing didn't really work out all that well. It really didn't produce that much of a flame. So you would want to mix that in with something else like beeswax or some soy-based thing or some other medium. Like you could do like a 50-50 blend or something like that. It didn't produce enough. It was like a very dim light. It was a cool project. We had all these like leftover glass candles from the wedding, like a whole box full. I was like, what are we going to do with this? Let's just try this. I mean, it worked for a little bit, but it didn't burn super well. So just a heads up with that. If you try that experiment, you can look up. I looked it up online, so you can look up different things you can use it for, because some of the doughs you get will be like loaded with fat. A lot of times the bucks are not, but if you have antlerless applications, or your state allows you to hunt antlerless without a separate license like PA here, you might get a doe and it might be really, really fatty. And you're going to be like, well, I wish there was something we could do with like this 5 pounds of fat I cut off of it, or 10 pounds sometimes. Like, okay, well, there's other applications out there. I think some people have made soap and stuff like that. You do need to go in and deodorize it and stuff like that. Anyways, getting off track here. So when we are cooking it, if you get those deer steaks, that would be my recommendation. Going with, if you are getting roast or ground or things like that, if you get ground, you can use it just like beef or lamb or anything else. It just depends on how lean it is. Like, is it 100% venison? It's going to be like, it's 95.5, 90. I wouldn't say 99.1 because there is some fat in there. It just depends on what cuts and how like strict it is with removing. So anywhere between 99.1 to, let's say, 90-10, somewhere in that range. So you just have to kind of like figure out other things you would cook like that. Like a 99.1 is going to be super dry if you really overcook it. So you might need to add some fat to it. It might work out for some meatballs and things where you're going to add other things to it, versus like a 90-10 still is good for a burger, or 93.7 still good for a burger. It's not going to be the juiciest, best burger in the world, but that's about what we do. Because I don't like too much fat. We try to do 93.7 or 95.5. When going to the roast and things, you can cook it exactly like a lot of beef and a lot of lamb. Think of recipes like that. Like, you can still do pot roast. You can still do these other things. It is leaner. So try to find recipes like, I have round beef recipes. That's generally a fairly like lean cut or sirloin recipes. They're leaner cuts of beef. So a lot of times special care is taken into like, are we going to marinate these? Are we going to tenderize them in some way? Are we going to cook them just to medium rare rather than like beef fall off the bone? There's multiple different things you can do with that. So you want to look kind of those recipes, and that's going to give you some options. Like pot roast is great. But there's a ton of options you can do. You don't have to get stuck in like, okay, we're just going to like fry it up. I had someone message me about like deer bites, where it's like you just cut them up into bite-sized thing and then deep fry them. Like, for a person like, oh, healthiest meat in the world. And then it's like, you just go and deep fry it. Like, again, like once in a while it's fine, but not exactly hell. You took the healthiest meat in the world, it just made it not the healthiest thing in the world. Even if you do the quote unquote healthier fats for frying, like, you're still adding a ton of fat, and there's the breading and everything else. Slow cooker is also a good option, especially if you add some fat to that recipe, which it's easier to like control how much fat's going to be in that recipe when you're adding. But with all the other like things in there, it can work out really well. And because we hunt for most animals in the fall, you're going to generally have fall and winter dishes. So it's a good time to experiment more with slow cooker things, rather than like, most people are kind of starting to run out come spring, summer, and you might just have ground left, and then it's like burgers and meatballs and things. But you don't need necessarily special recipes. Just treat it like another leaner piece of meat. Or some people will swap out, like you want red meat instead of like chicken breast. Well, boneless, skinless chicken breast is also like similar in like your macros, your protein, and your fat content. So all you can do is like swap them. Sometimes if that recipe like would work with red meat, you can do that. You can treat it kind of like chicken breast. So that's how you want to think of wild game. It's not super scary. It can be a little bit gamey. In which case, like you just cook up a small piece of it and see how it tastes with just like some salt. Like don't taste it without salt because you're going to cook it with salt. So throw some salt in there and cook it, medium rare, see how it tastes or whatever your preference is. And that'll guide you in the direction because every animal is going to be a little bit different. Now, if you order from Force of Nature, these are quote unquote wild game animals that are raised on a high fence farm. So there's thousands of acres that they're raised on or hundreds of acres. And they're kind of left alone, kind of like wild game, but they're in like a enclosed area. So it's not true wild game, but it is still elk or whitetail, whatever you would be hunting. They're just on a high fence farm with lots of area to roam and eat their natural diet and everything else. So those are going to be a little bit more consistent in their flavor. Whereas I've hunted and I've had deer that taste really close to beef. And I've had deer that it's like, that's deer. There's no denying that is deer meat. Like that's not beef. That's not lamb. That's deer. And I've had some that are like, that's gamey. That's a gamier deer that needs to be marinated. That's slow cooker with a bunch of flavors, like doing like some sort of French stew with like a bottle of red wine. And once you know what kind you have, then you can gear your recipes towards that. And you're not stuck with just frying it and throwing on a ton of like fatty stuff and bumping those calories way, 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 way up. Again, if you have a tradition of like I love like venison schnitzel and Jaeger schnitzel, super, super good. I really like doing it. Is it super healthy? No. But we'll do that a couple times a year, not every single time we have venison. I also just like doing a regular roast, sous videing it to like 125, then throwing it on the grill or cast iron, super hot, getting that nice sear, and that bumps up to maybe like 130, 135. So it's rare to medium rare. And then putting a like cutting that in chimichurri. Like it's just salt and pepper, and then we make a chimichurri and put that over that. That's one of my favorite things to do. You do that with a deer that you like the taste of. You don't do that with, chimichurri is fairly strong, but you're not like having that marinade. So you might get some bites that don't have any, and that can be if it's a gamier deer. So that's kind of like, hopefully this explains the wild game to you. A lot of times it's stronger flavors, but it can just be salt, pepper, maybe some garlic powder, some rosemary, things like that. If it's just like back straps, they taste really good. You don't need to do much to them. It can be very simple, very quick, but slow and low or hot and fast. Don't go in the middle or it's going to be terrible. And that's what a lot of people do. Some people are weirded out about the wild game thing and think it needs to be cooked well done. If you go that route, slow and low, do braising in the oven, or the stovetop for 2 hours, do slow cooker meals, instant pot meals, things like that. But they can also be tougher than beef. So what I've found with some shanks and shoulders and things like that, where it's a very like well worked, lots and lots of connective tissue in there, they can need to cook longer than beef to get tender. So do keep that in mind. We just did a shoulder roast. I just throw the whole shoulder roast, and it is loaded with collagen. You have all that connective tissue that breaks down, and it's super good, super tender and moist once it's broken down. But if you're early, it's rock hard, like it's rubber. So you do need to take a little bit longer. There's been a few Christmas Eves, so we always do ossobuco for Christmas. And I've used venison shakes the past couple of years, and year one and found like, hey, like follow the time, and they were not done. They needed much longer to actually get like almost fall off the bone tender. So do keep that in mind with some of those tougher cuts. I like to just like take the shoulder blade, that becomes a roast as long as it's small enough. Some of them are super big. And they're more tender that way too. You can just cut them up and grind them. I just like leaving those roast, and then we'll do barbacoa. We'll do a few French dishes with that, or some like ossobuco is more like Italian, with the shanks and the shoulders and those cuts. Also makes processing much faster. Now, my wife does like the flat iron, so if we get a decent sized buck or even like a decent sized doe, I will cut some of the flat irons out of a shoulder. It's a pain in the ass to get them, but they are delicious, and they're just like, you just need like salt in them, salt, pepper, maybe some garlic and rosemary. That's like my go-to for a steak as well. That's all they kind of need. So that's kind of like what deer, wild game in a gist. There's other wild game, obviously small game, duck, goose, squirrel, rabbit, grouse, pheasant. And the if it's going to be like the birds, duck, we already have duck recipes. Like just you can practice with regular like farm raised duck. Now, if it's diver duck, I've never had diver duck, but apparently they have more seafood flavor. So you're going to want to cut the fat off of those. Goose, I have yet to be successful with hunting, even though they're everywhere. They're never around when I'm hunting. On the other hand, what was it? Squirrel, rabbit things. You can look up rabbit recipes. That's a lot of European, French recipes have it. Even Italians, like I have a book over there. There's Italian recipes for rabbit, English, etc., German. You can use those recipes for it, but it is something I would say it's comparable to like, it's like a lean pork. Think of it kind of more like that aspect. It's obviously much smaller, but it needs to be cooked more well done like pork. And it's like a leaner cut of pork. So something like almost like a tenderloin, where it's like, okay, it's not as tender as a tenderloin, but something like that, where it's like you can't overcook it or it's going to get really dry because it is lean. Some of the pork chops and stuff. So you need to cook it just enough. And they can have like, especially squirrel can have a more gamier flavor. So if you're eating that, you kind of do need to marinate them or use some stronger flavorings with those. Again, a lot of times you see fried stuff. If you are, squirrel's not exactly something most people are like, ooh, I can't wait to eat that. It was more like a sustenance food. Some people really enjoy it. I enjoy hunting them, and so if I hunt them, I will eat them, but they are a pain in the ass to clean. I will say that. They're a pain not to get hair over everything. But if you do get access for whatever reason, I like Meat Eaters. They have a buffalo chicken wing recipe that uses squirrel. So it's like the legs and everything. You just basically fry them up like chicken wings, and you use a buffalo sauce. That's actually pretty good. It actually worked. They're tougher than chicken wings, but it works. It was pretty. My wife actually liked that. And we've done chili with squirrel. It's okay. It's not like if you replace squirrel with turkey for a chili, like it's okay. Again, not. I'll probably hunt squirrel a little bit, but not exactly something like meat wise. Like, ooh, it's more like they're just fun to hunt and kind of get you out in the woods, and they're a little bit of a challenge. Anyways, that's how to think of wild game. You don't need to be scared of it. Just compare it to another red meat that's lean. Try it out, see how the taste is. Like cut a little piece off, taste it, figure out what are you going to do with it. Or is it going to get marinated? Is it going to just be something quick and simple? And once you know kind of what the animal and the cut you're using, then it's very easy to do. Most deer is not gamey. However, if you get the deer steaks or it was improperly handled, it can get gamey, in which case lots of strong flavors are going to be needed, and that's fine. You just plan for that. Also, if you are a hunter, what I like to do is label all of them. So this was a doe harvested at this location on this date. Especially, I like the dates if you hunt kind of one property or a property you tend to get multiple off of. Then you can kind of label it, be like, this was X deer on this. So is it gamey or is it not? And once you start to cook it, you can be like, you can put an asterisk on them if you haven't put all the way like gamey, or you can just say like, once you know, it's like, hey, like that buck is really tough. It definitely needs to be like tenderized, like at least sous vide it, let that slowly cook over a period of time, and then we can cook it really fast on a grill or cast iron, or it needs to be slow cooked. Just doing like a regular, like throw it on into the cast iron or on a grill is going to be tough. It's not going to be exactly the best thing to do with it. We have other ones that we're going to grab if we need something just for like a quick dinner. Anyways, that's going to be it for today, guys. So as always, please reach out if you have any questions. Make sure to follow me on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, whichever is your preferred social media channel. You can ask me questions there. If you are interested in the Prime program, today is actually, when this is released, is going to be the kickoff for the next round of it. But if you're interested, you think you'd be a good fit for Prime, please message me. We can probably get you in. Is $397 for 16 weeks. So it comes out to just under $100 a month, which is a steal for this program. Everybody who went through the program and did everything, like they didn't like just ghost me and fall off, got results. Literally, it's not very often that it's like literally everyone was successful in the program that if they did the program, which is not crazy hard to do. It is do your check-ins, watch the education modules, it's going to make the education modules are going to be like at most early on is about an hour per week. And then later on, it's much, much less. And you can always, like, if you don't have time, you have an entire week before we go over it, you can always go back to them. It's not like you lose access. So if you're like, hey, like crazy week, you can always double up or stuff. You can listen to them on your drive home or stuff. So it's accessible. We know people are busy. So early on, there's a lot of education modules, and then it becomes less and less further down the program. So as long as you're getting your steps, you're tracking food, which is appropriate for your level and what we set for you. So if you're like, well, I don't have time to track full macros, great. We're not going to do that for you. Then your workouts, like 3 workouts per week. So as long as you're doing that, we had 100% of people get results with the program. It's pretty fucking awesome to see. Everyone had a great experience. Whether you were able to make the calls or you watch the recording, everybody had really, really good results. So I do recommend you guys try, if you're interested, you're thinking about doing something, message me. I can go over the program in more details and answer your specific questions about it. But as long as you're willing to commit, the modules are 12 weeks. So as long as you get 16. So as long as you're willing to commit to getting the modules done and learning, the big thing here is learning, and following the program, you will get results. Prime level 2 is also kicking off right now. So if you haven't done Prime level 1, you won't have access to that. But if you want continued education after Prime level 1, there's going to be that option too. But 100% of people who completed Prime level 1 have moved on to Prime level 2. So if that's telling you something, it's pretty awesome. So literally everybody who did the whole program wanted to stay on for another 16 weeks. So I would highly recommend, if you are interested in something, and if you need help financially, I understand, everything's fucking expensive right now. That's why I do free things like this podcast. Please reach out to us. But there's also free stuff down below. If you're really in a financial pinch, macro guide down below to help get you started. You can reach out to me. If you grab that and you have questions about your macros, like, hey, did I do this right? Please reach out. I will help you out with that. Anyways, that's it for this week, guys. If you have any questions, wild game, or about any new programs, make sure to reach out to me. Or I will see you guys next week.